This is a quiet story, told slowly. There's nothing you need to do, and nothing you need to remember. You can listen closely, or let the words fade into the background as you rest. The story will move gently, without sudden moments, and it will stay with you whether you're awake or drifting off. Tonight's story is The Room at the End of the Hall. The hallway narrowed slightly near the end, though Clara had never been sure if that was truly the case, or if her attention simply sharpened there. The house was old enough to have learned its own patterns. Floorboards dipped where footsteps had passed most often. Walls held warmth unevenly, releasing it slowly after the heating switched off. Light travelled differently in each room, settling into corners that felt familiar without being memorable. Clara moved through these spaces daily, guided more by habit than by sight. Only the final stretch of the hall ever asked her to slow. The door stood where it always had, flush with the wall, painted the same softened white as the rest of the corridor. The handle was dull with age, its surface smoothed by time rather than use. No lock set it apart. No mark or sign suggested it was different from the others. It was simply a door that had learned how to be passed. Clara walked past it every day. Sometimes she noticed the way her steps changed there, the slightest hesitation before continuing on. Other times she did not register the pause at all. It had become part of the corridor's rhythm, like the faint creak halfway along, or the place where the air felt cooler near the skirting board. She did not think of the room behind the door as forbidden. She had never told herself that it must remain closed. There was no rule attached to it, no memory sharp enough to demand avoidance. The door was not charged with fear. It was charged with absence. The room had been emptied years ago. At the time, Clara remembered carrying things out one by one. A small table, a lamp that no longer worked properly, a box of papers she had not opened since. She could recall the physical effort of it more clearly than the reason. The room had been made bare, then quiet, then slowly irrelevant. At some point, it had stopped being a room at all. Now, when Clara passed the door, she did not picture what lay behind it. The space existed only as a shape in the house's layout, a blank square she stepped around without effort. The door closed over it neatly, allowing the rest of the house to function without interruption. In the evenings, the hallway softened as lamps came on elsewhere. Light pooled gently along the walls, leaving the end of the corridor slightly dimmer. Clara often stood in the kitchen or sitting room, aware of the hallway without looking at it, as one is aware of a quiet room without entering. She lived comfortably here. Her routines were simple and steady. Tea made the same way each night. Dishes washed and set to dry. Curtains drawn just enough to keep the streetlight from pressing too closely against the glass. These acts did not feel repetitive. They felt anchoring. The house responded to them with its own quiet language, settling as she did. Later, as she moved toward the bedroom, Clara passed the door again. The pause came. It was small, barely a breath held before release. She did not stop walking, only slowed, as if allowing space for something that never quite arrived. Then she continued on, turned into the bedroom, and closed the door behind her. Sleep came easily. It often did. Her dreams, when they came at all, were thin and fleeting, dissolving before she could hold them. When she woke in the early morning, the house felt unchanged. Light moved across familiar surfaces. The hallway waited. The door remained closed. The days passed without distinction. Work, errands, evenings that folded neatly into one another. Clara did not mark time by the calendar so much as by the steady repetition of ordinary things. She noticed small changes in the world around her without attaching meaning to them. A colder morning, a neighbour's window left dark, the sound of rain moving through the street at night. One evening, as she stood in the hallway holding her mug, she noticed something slightly different. The light fell along the wall near the door at a new angle. Not brighter, not darker, just shifted enough to reveal texture she had not paid attention to before. The paint was uneven there, layered by years of quiet maintenance. The edge of the frame cast a faint shadow that made the door feel more present than usual. Clara set her mug down on the small table beside the wall. She didn't reach for the handle. She stood close enough to feel the difference in air near the door, the slight coolness held by unused space. It did not pull at her. It did not resist her. It simply existed, solid and unremarkable. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to see it as only what it was. A door, wood, paint, hinges set into plaster. The recognition brought a quiet release. Something she had been carrying without noticing, loosened, as though weight had been shifted rather than removed. She did not feel compelled to act on that release. She did not need to. Clara picked up her mug and carried it into the sitting room, leaving the hallway as it was. That night, she slept deeply. The door remained closed, but the pause she took as she passed it the next morning was shorter than before. The second time Clara stopped in front of the door, she did not pretend it was accidental. Morning light lay thin and pale along the corridor, caught by the wall's uneven paint and the slight dip in the floorboard near the skirting. The house was quiet in the way it often was after she left for work, though she had not left yet. Her mug sat on the small table, the tea gone lukewarm. The day outside was waiting, but not urgently. Clara stood with her hand hovering near the handle. She did not feel fear. What she felt was the strange hesitation that comes when a person realizes they have been repeating something for years without ever deciding to. Habit could feel like choice until it was questioned. Now that she was questioning it, the habit looked thinner. The handle was cooler than she expected when her fingers finally closed around it. The metal held the night's cold, a steady chill that did not resist her touch. She turned it slowly, not because it was stiff, but because the motion asked for care. The latch released with a soft click. The sound was ordinary. That was what unsettled her most. She had carried an idea of this door as something different, yet it opened as all doors did, giving way without argument. Clara pulled it toward her. The air that met her was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of dust and old paper. It was not unpleasant. It was simply unused. A room that had not been entered for a long time held a particular stillness, as though it had stopped listening. She waited a moment before stepping inside, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. The curtains in the room were drawn, thicker than she remembered, and they held the light back with quiet determination. The floorboards were bare and clean enough, though a fine layer of dust lay in the corners like settled ash. The room felt smaller than it had in memory, which made sense. Memory often enlarged what it could not enter. There was nothing dramatic waiting for her. No hidden furniture, no strange markings, no unexpected clutter. just emptiness, shaped by walls and silence. Clara stepped in, and the floorboard under her foot gave a soft creak, as if surprised to be used again. The sound travelled lightly through the room, then vanished. She did not close the door behind her. She left it open, allowing the hallway's faint brightness to reach into the space. She moved toward the window. The curtains were heavy and slightly stiff with age. When she drew them back, they resisted at first, then released with a small sigh. Light entered quickly, spreading across the bare floor in a pale rectangle. Dust motes rose and floated, visible only for a moment before settling again. The window looked out onto the side of the house, where a narrow strip of garden ran along the wall. Clara saw the familiar shapes there. A patch of grass, the low stone boundary, the same small bush that had grown slowly into its space. Nothing in the outside view suggested anything had been waiting for her. She stood with her hand on the windowsill and felt the coolness of the glass. The room behind her was still, the air slightly colder than the rest of the house. It had been holding itself in that state for years, untouched. Clara turned and looked around again. In the corner closest to the door was a cardboard box. It was the only thing in the room that did not belong to the room's emptiness. The box looked older than she expected. The edges softened. Tape yellowed with time. She had not noticed it at first, because it was the same color as the floor. She crossed to it slowly and knelt. The movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, though she did not intend it to. The box's surface was dusty. When she ran her finger along it, the dust gathered in a faint line, revealing the darker cardboard beneath. Clara opened it. Inside were objects she recognized without needing to name them. Not valuables, not sentimental treasures in the obvious sense, just fragments of a life that had once been arranged differently. A stack of letters tied with string, the paper edges curled slightly. A notebook with a worn cover. A small framed photograph turned face down. A scarf folded neatly, its fabric soft but faded. There was a faint smell of lavender clinging to it, not strong enough to perfume the air, but present enough to suggest it had once been deliberate. Clara lifted the notebook first. It was not a diary in the dramatic sense. It was a book of lists and small notes, handwriting steady and familiar. Shopping reminders, appointment times, names of people she had not spoken to in years. The pages did not contain secrets. They contained ordinary evidence of a day-to-day life. She turned a few pages and felt something loosen in her chest. The handwriting was hers, and yet it belonged to a version of her that felt both close and distant, a version that had filled space in the house differently, that had left notes because she had needed to remember more. Now, her days were quieter. She carried fewer obligations. She did not write lists often. Seeing the notebook made her realize how much she had changed without noticing. Clara set it back in the box and lifted the letters. The string was stiff from time. She untied it carefully and unfolded the first envelope. The letter inside was short, written in a hand she recognized immediately. Her mother's. The words were calm and practical, as they always had been, filled with small updates about weather and neighbors, and the steady rhythm of ordinary life. At the bottom, the familiar closing sat there with quiet affection. Clara did not read the letter all the way through. She did not need to. The sight of it was enough to bring the feeling of it back. She returned it to the envelope and placed it gently back in the stack. The letters did not feel heavy. They felt like items that had been set aside, not because they were painful, but because they were too full of life to be handled casually. The photograph was the last thing she touched. She turned it over slowly and looked at the image. It showed 3 people, close together, smiling in a way that was not posed. Clara was younger there. Her face held more sharpness, less softness around the eyes. Beside her stood her father, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his smile understated. Her mother stood on the other side, looking straight at the camera with a calm steadiness. Clara felt her breath catch, not in grief, but in recognition. The room suddenly made sense. It had not been kept closed because it held something frightening. It had been kept closed because it held a version of the past that she had not wanted to walk through every day. Not because she could not bear it, but because she had needed to live forward. And sometimes living forward required putting certain things in a room and letting the door stay shut. Clara sat back on her heels, the photograph still in her hands. The room around her was quiet, accepting. The light from the window held steady. The hallway beyond the open door looked unchanged, waiting without opinion. She placed the photograph back in the box and stood. There was no sudden clarity, no rush of emotion that demanded action, only the calm knowledge that the room was not an enemy. It was simply a place where life had been stored when it could not be carried. Clara looked once more around the bare space, then walked out into the hallway, leaving the door open behind her. The air in the corridor felt warmer immediately, as if the house had been holding its breath and had finally exhaled. Clara did not close the door right away. She moved through the rest of the house with an unfamiliar lightness, not because anything had been resolved, but because nothing was pressing against her any longer. The hallway felt wider now, though she knew that was not true. The walls had not shifted. The floorboards had not realigned themselves. Yet the space carried itself differently, as if relieved of a quiet tension that had gone unnoticed for years. She returned to the kitchen and rinsed her mug, the sound of water filling the room without interruption. The ordinary nature of the task grounded her. She placed the mug on the rack and dried her hands carefully, noticing how steady they felt. There was no tremor of afterthought, no sense that she needed to return immediately to the room she had opened. It would wait. The day unfolded much like any other. Clara left the house, locked the door, walked the familiar route to work. She listened to conversations, answered questions, moved through tasks that required attention but not urgency. At times she found herself thinking of the room, but the thought did not pull her away from what she was doing. It sat alongside everything else, integrated rather than intrusive. When she returned home in the evening, the first thing she noticed was the light. It traveled farther down the hallway now, slipping through the open doorway at the end and softening the wall beyond it. The door stood exactly as she had left it, neither fully open nor fully closed. The house had not adjusted it. It had not tried to complete the gesture for her. Clara set her bag down and stood in the hallway for a moment, observing the change. The open door did not feel like an invitation or a challenge. It was simply evidence of choice made and held. She walked into the room again, this time without hesitation. The air felt less cool than before, already beginning to match the rest of the house. The dust motes were gone, settled back into corners. The room did not feel different in substance, but it felt less removed. Clara moved to the window and opened it slightly, letting fresh air in. The breeze carried the outside world gently through the space, lifting the edge of the curtain without effort. She returned to the box and knelt beside it once more. This time, she did not take everything out. She lifted only the scarf and draped it over the back of the chair she brought in from the hall. She placed the photograph on the windowsill, not as display, but as acknowledgement. The notebook and letters she left in the box, closing the lid and sliding it neatly against the wall. The room did not need to be filled. It only needed to be included. Clara stepped back and looked at what she had done. The space remained spare, its walls bare, its floor unoccupied. Yet it no longer felt unfinished. It felt paused rather than abandoned, held rather than avoided. She left the room again and moved through her evening routine. Dinner, dishes, the quiet progression toward rest. At some point she realized she had passed the end of the hallway without slowing at all. Later, as she prepared for bed, Clara returned one last time. She stood in the doorway and looked into the room, now faintly illuminated by the hall light. The scarf rested where she had placed it. The photograph caught a sliver of reflection from the window. The air moved gently, the open window allowing the room to breathe. Clara did not step inside. She reached for the door and closed it part way, leaving it ajar. The latch did not click. The door rested against the frame without sealing itself. That felt right. She turned off the hall light and walked to the bedroom. When she lay down, sleep arrived slowly, comfortably, as though the house itself had settled into a new arrangement. Her thoughts did not return to the room. They did not need to. The door would remain as it was, closed enough to be quiet, open enough to be honest. In the days that followed, Clara noticed the change not in the room, but in herself. The hallway no longer asked for a pause. The house felt more evenly balanced, its spaces carrying equal weight. She moved through it without adjusting her pace. The room at the end of the hall did not become a place she used every day. It did not need to. It existed now as part of the whole, neither hidden nor demanding attention. Clara understood, in the quiet way understanding sometimes came, that she had not been avoiding the room itself. She had been giving herself time. Now, time had given her space in return.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, comment, share and subscribe. Thank you for supporting the channel.